Hi, everybody, and welcome to an episode of Incidentally in the News. Today, we're excited to welcome one of our advisory board members, General Wheeler. General Wheeler, thank you for being here.
Well, I appreciate that, Erin. Thank you for having me here today. For those that don't know me, I retired out of the Air Force about 4 years ago. I left as a deputy DoD CIO. I've spent most of my time as a combat aviator and got involved heavily into the communication aspects. I'm an engineer by education. And Erin's asked me to come in here today and make some comments about some things that I've been involved with, especially as I left the government, working on various aspects of nation state cyber attacks, as well as other non-nation state cyber attacks. And she's asked me to come in here today and have a few questions about what that means to both government as well as the commercial enterprises. Back to you, Erin.
I love it. Yeah. So, I always claim that I'm the resident Luddite, the newbie in the industry. So I need a lot of things explained. So I'm going to start with an executive order that I saw right before President Trump left office. He actually started asking all government agencies to evaluate the purchase or acquisition of drones, Chinese made specific. And of course, that reflected upon a couple of other executive orders he had executed during his term, being that he was banning bulk electric power systems and, of course, information and communications technology. And so for someone like me and for some of our clients, trying to determine the difference between where the government's looking at this as a nation state threat, if you will, and then where private sector needs to go, what signal should we be taking from those types of messages and how do we need to bring it into our business? I guess if you could just start there.
Okay. Well, so if I was to take this, let's take it to 100,000 feet, the strategic layer that we're talking about here. And I would take that all three of those examples, and I'll walk through all three of those for you. It's basically about the information revolution. If you think about what's going on and the fact that everything that we have is going to be controlled at the information level, in other words, ones and zeros, it tells you where we're going internally as a nation and worldwide, and the fact that who controls that really has an ability from a leverage perspective, whether it's a business side, having all this data. Think of a giant data lake where they can make decisions faster than anybody else. Too, if they don't like something, they can control it, turn it on or off, or cause it to do things that we don't want it to do.
Right.
So I think there's both aspects to this where it can have both a impact to commercial as well as to government. So let's walk through some of those examples and maybe illuminate a little bit. So I think the one we can think about right now is Huawei. That was one of them from a communications perspective.
Right.
Why does that matter from that particular perspective? Well, if you think about third generation, fourth generation, in other words, 3G, 4G, it was mostly about the commercial aspect of it. It was about your phone. It was about, I can get a movie faster, I can watch my Netflix, I can text quicker, I can get an Uber. I mean, those are enabling capabilities of 4G. 5G, on the other hand, still does all the commercial aspects, but it does something unique and different by virtue of its technology. The speeds and the latency, the delay that it has there make sensors in real time. So I can now control unmanned vehicles. So if I'm thinking about where we're going to be without driverless cars, if I was to use a 4G network to interrelate vehicles, you wouldn't be able to actually have the sensor put on the brakes for over 3 feet. If you think about it from a 5G perspective, it's inside of an inch. So if you can imagine somebody hacking, I think of Washington, D.C., I used to go down Route 66. That could be complete calamity in one day and shut down an area if you could control that. Other ways, robotics. Robotics inside of factories. I can think of food supplies. I can think of all those various aspects to it. The one that probably in the 5G one that makes me the most worried is that many of our power grids are going to be controlled in wireless configurations. So ICSs and SCADAs will be in it. Dams, Tennessee Valley Authority's already looking at 5G networks to control dams. That was never a part of what we used to do in 4G because it didn't make sense. Now it's much better. The technology allows you to do it. The other part of it is something more fundamental. And that is, if you think about a Huawei network in the different parts of the world, they're surveillance networks. It's a very different aspect. If you think about a Western application of 5G, it's about privacy of the individual, enabling an incubator for new ideas and protection of intellectual property. Right. It is really the difference between a government that is a democracy and a government that is basically a dictatorship, if you will, in that. And it really does make a difference in networks. Okay, I'm going to jump again. Let's talk about the drones. In the drone one, fasting. So the Chinese are actually able to put out drones very quickly. They were doing it internal to the country, and they were also bringing back all the data. It actually connects back to the 5G, that data lake again. So the particular example of there was Department of Homeland Security was using them for various different aspects, not just along the borders, but also protecting power grids,
Right.
looking at water supplies, all those different things. And all that data was going to different places that we couldn't control. So
Right.
that's another aspect to it. And so they are worried about the data one more time. So we talked about the 5G aspect of it. We've talked about the communication side, electrical power grid. That's a really interesting one.
Yeah.
What has happened over the years is the transformers, the big, giant, capable parts of the system that really run our power system, have typically been made only in the US. So that's kind of branched out. They're made in one place right now in California, but they're also made in South America, and they're also made in China. Any big kind of solar flare or some kind of damage that was done to our nation's power grid, we would be really hard pressed to get enough transformers to replace them. And this could be something that's just not our country. It could be Canada, Mexico. So there's a natural potential here for a natural disaster that could happen, that we need to have our own indigenous supply. And frankly, the other pieces and parts to it could be used as methodologies of turning things off or turning things on, so that we could lose parts of our power grid. So it's really about the information revolution and the fact that every single one of these tool sets is controlled by a electronic piece that can be controlled by cyber. So you talked about nation states.
Yeah.
Last comment I'll make.
Yeah.
Nation states could hold us hostage, but you could also be held hostage by a criminal organization or group of them that have used these sets of tools to actually hold, whether it's a ransomware for a hospital is a prime example of that we see today, or it can be done on a major nationwide basis to control ICUs or something of that nature at a nation state level. So it is really blurred between what is a nation state and what is a criminal attack, and the protections are actually the same, to be frank.
So, I mean, I'm thinking about, and I'm just saying this because I'm going through the process of buying a house right now. Drones are being used prolifically in the real estate industry, right? So if I'm if I am Keller Williams and I've got, 5,000 drones in all my field offices that are being used now to take pictures, very small industry, whatnot. But how do they then go, oh gosh, do I have to check my drones? Do I have to worry about whether there's people who are, manipulating the technology within my drones? Like, how do you actually pull that through to the commercial sector?
Yeah, that's fair. So I think it's application dependent. So if I was to take a look at open commercial data, I'd be less worried about it. I would argue that probably where the government should step in is to make sure that the protections are there for those drones, so that they could not cause a problem in our air route traffic control systems, cause a problem with the airlines, et cetera. That's one level of government that you'd want to have involved in that, just because we keep our airways safe. I mean, it's incredible. Nobody has died in a U.S. crash in 12 years. I mean, that's an incredible number.
Yeah.
And so that kind of protections, if you will, are something that we should be very proud of.
Right.
But that aspect of it. Now, on the personal information that they have for inside of that, I think for the most cases they can have a level of cybersecurity that's commensurate with what is private and what is commercial data. So if they're just taking pictures of people's outside the houses, that's one level of commercial protections. If there's a privacy aspect to it, that's going back to the argument between the states that if it's private data, that it's going to have to be managed at a different level. So I think that's where you're going to it.
Yeah.
And I'll give you the example of where this comes up. Google. Google does maps all over the place.
Yeah.
And where they're getting into battles is, if you've ever noticed, if you're doing your Google Street View, you can get inside of people's garages sometimes if the garage was open when they were driving down the street. Yeah. That's causing a privacy issue. The first part's commercial data, but when you start looking in people's yards and different things, that becomes a different level. So this is where the Europeans are probably ahead of the U.S. Because they're really privatizing that, because they see that the personal privacy is an aspect. It's a pillar of democracy.
Right. Yeah.
And so that is an aspect that we have to look at. I know California's gone deep in that. The biggest problem for the U.S. is they're trying to find a balance between where the U.S. is today and where California is. Because in some, I'm not California, but Europe. Yeah. I have a joke for that, but I won't here. Anyways,
so we're always trying to go. I come from automotive industry.
But where California ends up being, or in this case, Europe, is probably more than we want. But at the same token, we have to go more into the privacy aspect for ourselves here.
Yeah. I have a claim to fame of being on a Google Maps. I'm in the Google Map route of America. I guess they snapped it when I was working there, so I'm out front of the building. I'm very excited about my fame there. I was
Yes.
actually a little creeped out though that someone saw it and said, "I think I saw it." And I go, "Yeah, that is a little creepy given the technology."
But you see,
Yeah,
they kind of, in a sense, they actually
yeah,
violated your privacy a little bit.
yeah,
You didn't authorize them to do that.
right, right.
So that's a great example of something that you should not feel creeped out by Google. You should not.
Exactly. And so I wonder, I was speaking about the SolarWinds attack because, of course, that's in all the news. But what the really interesting thing for me was that it did hit a substantial amount of government agencies, right? But then it also did go into the commercial sector, which again sort of held up the same sort of discussion we're having here is things that affect the government. How do the commercial sector supposed to think of, well, why would they care about my data, or what do they want to do with it? We know ransomware, we know privacy data can be hacked and stolen, but it really ended up looking like they were spying or something. And so how do you help people better understand ways to look at that particular attack or supply chain attacks period in cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think the easiest way for them to understand something, that it's estimated by the Commerce Department, and I think it's a very low estimate, that 1% of our GDP is lost to intellectual property
Right.
theft just by cybersecurity. That is, Aaron, that's a prime example of how
Yeah.
much it matters. Can you imagine today what 1% extra GDP would do in a time of COVID, and how that could
Right.
help our nation? And I mean, some of our best and brightest ideas are being taken away. Our
Right.
nation is an incubator for that. And it's unequivocally, you can say pros and cons of democracy, but that level of competitiveness pulls out of people things that really you won't get in other parts of the world, in different places. And I really mean that, because there's still a hunger to make a difference in the world that's I believe truly American. And so
Right.
so from that perspective, I think it's very important for industry to understand that they're losing what they so cherish if they're not protecting it right off the
Right.
bat. And so that's right off that. Now, the SolarWinds example is a great example of a country that is persistent, that is disciplined in how they did it, and they kept using that tool set to get the right credentials so it could be spread like wildfire.
Right.
And frankly, it also shows a factor of the fact that we were a little bit undisciplined as a
Right.
nation, and we don't have the right rule sets that are in there, and it's because, frankly, and part of it's just our culture. We trust,
Right.
and it's a good thing. But in this case, it's not a good
Right.
thing, because that's being taken advantage of across the board. And so what you're seeing here is the intellectual property theft side, and also just the spying overall, so
Right.
they can get advantage, whether it's in business or politics,
Right.
or so they can understand who we are. So I think that we're going to have to realize that the idea of government and industry in some cases is heavily blurred today, and that we're going to have the right protections. I honestly believe that sometimes I see industry looking to government
Yeah.
for all the answers, and I frankly believe many of those answers rest in I should say in industry,
Right.
and they need to be presented in more of a public-private partnership. We're in a new world. This is like the Industrial Revolution. This revolution that we're in of ones and zeros. This is new ground, and
Right.
typically industry is much more ahead in these new ground areas than government is. So
Right.
that partnership, how we work together as a team, has never been more important. Instead of, I always tell companies, stop waiting for the RFP, the request for proposal, the request for information. Do an unsolicited proposal. Tell them how you're going to fix their problems before they even ask. I
Right.
mean, just be aggressive. And I think that's the way to look at it, because frankly, they need your help. And
Right.
whether it's industry or whether it is government. And I can't imagine an area in government today where they need more help than in this particular area.
Right.
And I do mean that. And if you think about our laws that actually protect us in the privacy, even as a democracy, we have the most stringent laws.
Right.
You can do a lot more in Australia or UK when it comes to these kind of rule sets that government can do than you can in the US. So here, we actually need industry's help more than any other place by virtue of our laws.
Yeah. And it's interesting you talk about that, because it feels a little bit, the cybersecurity maturity model certification that's coming out to the DoD. So a lot of people are now talking about, is that going to help strengthen the cybersecurity defenses of government contractors and government agencies? And then you have the commercial sector, and everyone sort of knows that CMMC will likely start to inform other regulations that will come down to the industry. But what I think I hear you saying, and what I would agree with, is how does industry come and meet that beforehand? How do we, from a civil society or an industrial society, meet those challenges and come up with that public-private solution, as opposed to consistently waiting for regulations to come down?
That's fair. I think CMMC is going to be a journey. I honestly believe that. I think first off, right away, it's a regulatory framework more. It's and I think companies need to understand The compliance with that is going to be a box to check within there, and all compliance things in cybersecurity make me nervous. I mean, I set up the first, there was a report card for every different group, and it was how you begin. It's how you educate. I mean, it's part of the piece that we have to understand. I mean, this phone today that I'm handing has more data than what we used to have in all of our personal files, everything that we used to have, and it's incredible what this thing has. So the idea of having a CMC is a start. It's a compliance piece, but you got to go much farther if you want to protect your stuff. So this is where industry can really roll in. They can say, okay, we get your CMC, we get that it matters, and we're going down this path, but here's what you also need to do. And I'll give an example where that was. If you think about 5G, the US does not have the factories per se of building all the different parts and pieces within the 5G ecosystem that we have today that we need. I mean, frankly, the West doesn't have that for the most part. So it doesn't matter just the US. And so we're getting there, but that takes years to build factories. In the meantime, instead of just hitting that direct on what does the US do great? We're software kings and we are good at it. And we really do. So why don't we do what we need to do anyways and start virtualizing this stuff early on, minimize the amount of hardware and use that software, which we're damn good at, as a way to change that equation and use what we do best in our advantage. And frankly, if we're going to virtualize all these networks anyways, and we need to do that so that we can reconfigure as necessary, this is just the perfect opportunity to say, okay, let's dump the amount of hardware we have today so that we're not as exposed while we're building factories to build that, up the amount of software which is made in the West and can be controlled a little bit easier from that particular perspective, and move forward. And that is a way to drop your risks down very quickly. And it's not something that's just a tit for tat. It's actually something that makes sense economically. So it actually helps business in the US or the West for that matter. And at the same time, it ups the cybersecurity, and it's a win-win for both sides. And that's the route I typically like to go see versus a compliance. Compliance is necessary, but we got to go beyond that. I look for the win-wins, Aaron, so that we can move forward on stuff.
I love it. I mean, I just want to follow your energy into making all of this happen, because the energy you bring to the conversation is awesome. And I think it's true. I mean, we at CyberClan believe that the best defense is an offense. And how do you make sure that you're, playing your role? You don't need some compliance to tell you that you need to get secure in your environment. That's just good common sense. It's cost of doing business in the United States and anywhere, frankly. The threat is real and it's criminal, which is the other thing that we've continually had to help people understand, because a lot of people really can't even wrap their heads around the fact that it's criminal. When you are hacked, it's a crime. And I think a lot of people really hold that over here, and they don't necessarily think so much about that. So this has been fascinating as always. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to make one comment. If you think about your intellectual property being stolen, in some cases, governments do that to get on secrets. But in some cases, that same governments have been known to give them to local companies to help their economies. I mean, and this is an example of how it just blurs across all of this in the new world that we're in today. I mean, this is the idea of ones and zeros and how they reach the world. It's the new ocean, the new commerce. It's something that people don't realize, and it's going to be far more important than oil of the past. And I just don't think people fully get that. So
I love it. Wow, this has been so helpful. I really, again, love the energy you bring to the conversation, and also just the depth of knowledge. And I hope that this is helpful for our listeners. And I hope that we can bring you back and have conversations about all sorts of things, especially 5G. There's more to come, more discussions to be had around that. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for putting me up. And hopefully I didn't talk too fast this time, Aaron. I tend to do that always. You get the verbal Gatling gun. You get that verbal Gatling gun.
I like someone who goes the same pace as I do. So that's perfect. I love it. You're great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. My pleasure.